University of Houston. And we are so pleased to welcome all of you to tonight's public program, co-hosted by myself and Tyler Blackwell, our Cynthia Woods Mitchell Associate Curator and the co-curator of Carriers, The Body as a Site of Danger and Desire, which is only on display at the Blaffer until March 14th. So I heartily encourage all of you who have not yet seen the show and who can, please visit us. We are open Wednesdays to Sundays, noon to 5, and we are always free. And we welcome your reservations online. And just so pleased this is the last public program that we will be holding in association with the exhibition. And it's really one of the greatest benefits of being here at the University of Houston to have the opportunity to see and think about the exhibition through the lens and through the eyes of some of our colleagues here at UH. And we are just so grateful to have the opportunity tonight to see the show with and through the lens of Dr. Rachel Laffy Quinn, who is really one of our greatest friends and supporters on campus. We love what she does and how she thinks, and it is such an opportunity to really hear her perspective and interpretation of the exhibition. And I have to say that Tyler and I are as eager as an audience as all of you. So for tonight, I'm going to hand it off to Tyler, who will give Rachel a biographical introduction, and then we will sort of set the stage for a question. And then Rachel's going to do some presentation, kind of walk us through the exhibition via installation photos. And we're going to have a dialogue throughout. We're going to talk about some of the curatorial considerations, as well as the way that Rachel sort of sees the work through her academic perspective. And then we hope by the end of it, we'll have time to open it up to Q&A to all of you. So I will now hand it off to Tyler.
Hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. My name is Tyler Blackwell, and I'm very glad, eager to introduce Rachel. Rachel Laffy Quinn is an assistant professor of women's gender and sexuality studies, as well as comparative cultural studies at the University of Houston. Dr. Quinn received a PhD in American culture from the University of Michigan. Her transnational feminist cultural studies scholarship focuses on mixed race, gender, and sexuality in the African diaspora, and her forthcoming book is about Dominican women's transnational identities in Santo Domingo. At UH, she is a recipient of the Ross M. Lentz Award for Teaching Excellence in the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences, as well as acting as a co-creator of the UH Critical Disability Studies Initiative. And finally, Rachel is also the co-founder of the social justice feminist collective, South Asian Youth in Houston Unite. In 2015, Dr. Quinn was part of a filmmaking team that produced the documentary Cimarron Spirit about contemporary African Dominican identities. Her recent essays include No tienes que entenderlo, solo respetarlo, Xiomara Fortuna, Racism, Feminism, and Other Forces in the Dominican Republic, which was recently published in The Black Scholar. As well as Spinning the Zoe Trope, Visualizing the Mixed Race Body of Dominican actress Zoe Saldana, which was published in Latin American published in Latin American and Latinx visual culture. And then excitingly, as I mentioned just a second ago, Dr. Quinn's first book, Being La Dominicana, Race and Gender in the Visual Culture of Santo Domingo, will be published this forthcoming June with the University of Illinois Press. So we're so glad that Rachel is able to join us tonight. And then I'm just going to pose a sort of large overview question, which is the sort of impetus for this program that can lead us sort of into a discussion about Rachel's scholarship and her own thinking, as well as a beginning of thinking about the works in this exhibition. So Dr. Quinn, as an educator and a scholar of transnational identities and their relationships to gender, race, and sexuality, which artists, which artworks and carriers sort of speak to you most strongly, perhaps, as a way of illuminating or problematizing these sort of larger subjects?
Thank you so much, Tyler. So it is a treat to be here and in conversation with all of you, and I'm hoping the dynamic will feel more like a conversation, and that as you have questions, you can put them in the chat. I do have several different ways that I might answer that question around what connected with me in this exhibition, which was quite broad with, I think, 15 artists. But I wanted to tell you a little bit about my book project, which will be out in June, and how I've informed my thinking on visual culture that brings me to this conversation. I really appreciate being invited to share my thoughts on the exhibition, and I have benefited from the Blaffer Museum's exhibitions over the last 8 years that I've been, almost 9 years that I've been at University of Houston. And I've had the opportunity to bring students, most recently to Paul Sepoya, but also you had Miriam Ghani's film and installation, and all of the work that I've had the opportunity to engage with both on our campus and then broadly in Houston has been shaping how I think about visual culture and the work that I do, which has been focused on the lives and experiences of women in Santo Domingo and the Dominican Republic. And so the book project that I developed that came out of my dissertation started more as an ethnographic project, but with the time that I spent in Santo Domingo and getting to know cultural producers on the ground, feminist activists and women of color on the ground, I was seeing the ways that they were using visual culture and social media to represent themselves and articulate their identities and experiences. And I was asking questions about mixed race and how they were articulating their relationship to Blackness. And they were doing that in protest art, in online campaigns, and also in theater and film. And so I diversified a kind of visual lexicon that I had, and it moved it to thinking more transnationally and how things resonate across national lines and to different people. And so in my book project, what I'm trying to advance some ideas around context-specific racial identity and racial fluidity and the experience of individuals. So my work is in transnational feminism. It's nice to see Elora Chaudhry here in our conversation because she's also really shaped my thinking and how I approach my research in ethnography. And so many of you in this conversation, I've been able to engage with and learn from around looking at visual culture. So like today is, I think, sort of a major shift in how I engage as a scholar, because I am really interested in having more of these kinds of conversations looking at cultural production. And it's really a treat to talk about the work of Houston artists, many of whom I have gotten to know over the years and seen their work exhibited in other locations. And so I approached reading this exhibition really with enthusiasm for what the intersections are and where the works ended up in conversation with one another. So I'm going to have some questions for the curators as well to talk about how they made those decisions. And I'm interested in learning about that. I'll say also that in moving from like visual culture online and like how folks are producing that, the next book project that I'm looking at is about photography in the archive of a particular figure, Philippa Schuyler, and her work is at the Schomburg, or her archive is at the Schomburg, and she grew up in the Harlem Renaissance, but then travels around the world, and not unlike myself, had an experience of being racially interpreted in terms of race differently depending on which context she was in. And so like those kinds of questions spur my interest in what do we see when we're looking at or looking for race, and how it's really different depending on your social position and how you're looking and what story you bring. So this exhibition, Carriers, actually becomes a challenge because there's so many different points of view being represented. And so you'll get just a little bit about what I see. Will you, Amanda, pull up?
Maybe Rachel, if I could just jump in for a second. I realize that for our guests that maybe aren't in Texas or in Houston, that I should have introduced the exhibition a little bit. So maybe I'll just take 1 minute just to say that Tyler and myself organized this exhibition, Carriers, The Body as a Site of Danger and Desire, First and foremost, as a response to COVID-19 and the pandemic. And I think we all know that everyone has immense fatigue around this, that we're all looking towards the light at the end of the tunnel and when we can escape this set of circumstances. So we didn't want to create an exhibition that would just sort of sink us deeper into despair or distress. We really thought about how could we offer a valuable reflection. And I think what struck us most was the dichotomy that the body is placed into under this condition, where we are now in this place of isolation and alienation and social distancing, where we long for that human contact and intimacy that we once took for granted. But at the same time, we need to be wary and afraid and concerned about the presence of bodies around us and breath, because they are the carriers of a life-threatening disease. And so we were very much struck by this ambivalence and this very conflicted relationship that we have to the body in this particular environment. And so we wanted to look at that through a Houston perspective. And that's why the choice to gather 15 artists from Houston, really from all the way from emerging to very established. And like Rachel said, gathering a number of perspectives. One thing I did want to point out is that a number of these works, probably 90%, were not produced in direct response to COVID-19. They were made anywhere between 2003 and 2019. And then there are a few that were made in response. But we thought that by bringing these works together, we could gain a greater understanding of the pandemic, that works took on added levels of meaning and context in the situation. So just a very brief overview of some of our thinking. And now we'll hand it over to Rachel.
Thank you. Please jump in at any time. Okay, so the slides of the many images of the exhibition I selected, it was difficult to narrow down. So you will see many of the artists' work, and their work crosses different spaces. But there might be a few artists that are not represented here, but I hope we'll still be able to talk about their impact. So I started just with the entry point for me, and I'm on the right side of this image, you can see a work by Pritika Rajagaraya, and on the left side, I'm going to focus on the work of Nick and Jake when you enter in the space. And it actually, there's a video that we won't look at, but your movement, I guess, triggers the audio for that, this kind of a bit ominous sound, thank you, of them in a performance piece. So there's several performance pieces through the space, and I'll talk a little bit around how sound moves us through the space as well. But what I was interested in with this at the entry place, and as a scholar of critical race theory, is thinking about whiteness as the backdrop for this and their own work. The topic is the AIDS epidemic, and the paint, although it's described as a pink paint, it really comes off as sort of red color. The title is Sitting in One Pandemic, Thinking of Another. And I thought it was especially effective entry point, but very subtle in the movement in the performance piece. And so what came up for me is thinking about how we understand this pandemic as disproportionately impacting people of color. And yet we enter into this exhibition and they so thoughtfully offer this kind of artifacts and archive of the performance that then become the work. I also noticed, and I'm hoping Nick or Jake will be in conversation. We got to hear from them a little bit on Monday night, but the traces and the echo and the outline that emerge because of the paint. And what's interesting on the figure on the left, the mannequin, is that drip of paint that actually kind of has this phallic shape that we associate with the AIDS epidemic and gay sex, and how pathologized gay men have been in relation to that pandemic. So that is how I entered into the exhibition. And yeah, so whiteness is a theme that moving through the spaces, I resonated with me as I try to teach in gender studies courses in this kind of area, and also in teaching critical race theory. So, but then I'll walk you through There's some other pieces, and I think I'll say that Ryan Hawk's discussion of his work, which is around the corner, he's also talking about masculinity, and he really articulates that he's talking about white masculinity in his piece. And I didn't include it here, but I really valued hearing from him about the body and how he's articulating the racialized body. And there's something about the audio of that work. There's the sound of a fan deflating, or it's like it's the deflation of the kind of plastic over a body. And so we hear that sound, the video. And then when you move upstairs, which I want to do with the next slide, and I don't include his piece again, but he's present there. There's videos of his work, and there's something about how he captures the sound of this fleshiness. So that led me, through this space. And I hadn't mentioned how this kind of viewing, I viewed it on just with my partner moving through the space before other guests were there, and it was a very different way to experience the museum. But I felt like this piece in this room, this auntie that made out of cloth that Pritika Rajgaraya created, was like another guest in the space. So in my reading, she's turned to this work of art by Laffy Olivia. And so I wanted to turn to that next slide. So you can see on the left works by Nick and Jake, and on the right, the work by Laffy Olivia. And I don't know, how large an image you have it, but this thing about longing to be exactly in that space. So there's this sense of loss. And again, like for me, I didn't experience analyzing the experience was about also my body in the space. And I felt very distant from folks. So I didn't have that experience I had in other spaces since the pandemic of this anxiety that we carry with us about interacting with others. So it was very interesting to me to witness this piece by Laffy Olivia, where I was sort of longing to be again in this space of connection and community. It's a set of figures, people of color mainly, mingling. And so I felt like Pritika's piece, as you've positioned it, also captured that longing. So that's one space in the work where I kind of started to see some of your intentionality in the curation, and I'm going to ask you some more questions about how you made these decisions about these moments of intersection. So, and I didn't to fully answer and think about this question that Tyler posed. In my work, I have been thinking a lot about Black and South Asian solidarities. And so I know Pritika Rajgaraya and Laffy Olivia and their partnership, and I'm paying a lot of attention to their work and interested in how they influence one another in the works that they're developing. And so I also encountered this moment as one of these Black and South Asian solidarities that I have seen, that I see a lot in my own work, aside from the example I give of the mentorship that I've received from South Asian scholars, but also artists and activists. And so in my work with South Asian Youth in Houston Unites, we're actually archiving a lot of interviews and conversations. I hope to get these two artists in that conversation, thinking about what are the solidarities amongst Black and South Asian folks, particularly in Texas, and how are these communities, at some moments they are up against one another, as we see with our youth, and at other moments they're really disparate communities. Next room, please. Okay. So when you go up the stairs, you move past some photographs that Sadaf has done on the left and into this room, and we'll talk a little bit about her work. But what captivated me, especially in this upstairs room, is the intersection of the work of three artists on the back wall. So this is where I'm going to ask Stephen and Tyler to talk a little bit about their thinking on bringing together the visual works of, again, Pritika Rajgaraya on the right at the top, and then Honduran American artist Jasmine Zelaya at the bottom two pieces, and then at the top right, Michael Ray Charles's work. So the one more image, I think we'll zoom in on that, and maybe you can join me in a conversation, Stephen and Tyler, about how you brought these together. What I saw was that they visually, in terms of the materials, they resonated. But then there is this question we just are getting at around identity in terms of transnational identity and experience. And when I see Rajgaraya's work, I think about, like, how do you merge Texas identity and the South Asian background, and what gets lost? And so there's these ways that I think this piece captures, what people are seeing of her and losing in viewing her. And so I'm curious how you're interpreting these pieces and what choices you were making to pull these together at this intersection.
Stephen, do you want to begin?
Yeah, and thank you, Rachel. And I want to you've hit so many nails on the head, I think, through your observations. And I think you've even sort of drawn out some threads within the show that I think maybe Tyler and I were confronting in a subconscious way, and I want to just rewind a little bit, because I think you really nailed it when you said that sort of entering into that space, and Nick and Jake and Ryan Hawk and these ideas around whiteness, because I think one of the other thematic areas that emerged out of the organization of this show, like I mentioned, we were responding to the pandemic. But I think both Tyler and I saw in the selection of the work and the artists that we were also wrestling with what I think that the immense trauma of what happened to George Floyd, and this centuries old violence inflicted upon bodies of color that obviously connects with Eric Garner and I Can't Breathe, and all of these ways that systemic racial violence kind of manifest themselves through that act of sort of the violence inflicted upon a body. And so I think that, in a lot of ways, that entryway, these sort of more performative works that were less finished, in some ways speaks to kind of that pathology in the pandemic of white violence, and sort of being inflicted upon bodies of color. And I think that became an equally thematic presence within this exhibition. So I think that is another sort of thread that weaves us through the exhibition. But I really want to hand it off to Tyler, because Tyler came up with this particular arrangement that we're looking at. And the more I look at it, the more I love it and the more I sort of find in it. But I want to hand it off to Tyler because he really sort of orchestrated this particular grouping.
Thanks. I mean, I think with the works, I mean, each artist we see here, Michael Ray Charles, Jasmine Zelaya, and Preeti Rajgaraya, as Rachel mentioned, their works are included in sort of more focused opportunities in other situations, other moments in the exhibition. And here with this sort of particular grouping, Stephen and I sort of found first, perhaps some formal or aesthetic reasons for thinking about their works in context with each other. Jasmine's practice, for example, of using this sort of adornment or ornamentation in her works. And Jasmine's are the bottom two works, the figure of a mother on the bottom left, and then this sort of homage to Manet's Olympia on the bottom right. You can't quite perhaps tell in this image, but they are sort of, they are made with various sort of rhinestone-like or pearls, different sort of additive elements that become a sort of labor-based practice for Jasmine as a part of making the work that speak to larger themes about beauty and aesthetics of brown women's bodies, essentially. And then we think too about the sort of images that Michael Ray Charles uses in his work, which is sort of appropriating what's the right phrase? Images from old time vintage advertisements or sort of stereotypes of Black bodies. You can't quite tell, again, in this image, the sort of red shapes you see are smiles that are in the shape of a watermelon that he has then sort of used in multiple instances in the form of this gun, and then the sort of gold around it is glitter. So this is the sort of image of extreme violence that then has been made more complex by his use of making this to be beautiful and sort of alluring in this use of glitter. And then also thinking about Pridika's photographs here, which are the other works of hers in the exhibition, are these sort of larger scale paintings. And these photographs in particular, one is called Adorn, and the other, I'm blanking on the name of the other work, are both other instances of a sort of very specific cultural reference of a particular fabric or these particular sort of hanging jewelry that is on the image on the right. And so again, thinking about what does it mean to sort of perform or beautify, illustrate these sort of references to a cultural narrative, or a sort of, in Jasmine's case, a familial narrative, while also sort of depicting these images that are of women, of bodies that are sort of historically the sites of violence.
Yeah, and I think just quickly, I think Tyler really sort of was able to, thinking about the aesthetics of ornamentation, and particularly when they move into the realm of excess, that you can see that sort of when we think about ornaments, they can become essentialized, especially in an ethnographic arena, to the point where they erase the individual identities. And we read people through sort of the cultural ornamentation that is most attached to particular cultures. And I think Tyler has really woven together a number of pieces and images here that speak to that speak to the sort of way that identity can be obscured through excess of ethnographics and ornamentation.
Mm-hmm. And I think Charles' work really hits home with that. And if you look kind of at the bottom of the hand, you can see the caricature, that Black caricature with the bright red lips. And in conversation later on, I'll show like how his work works so nicely in conversation with Zelaya's work, who's also using this adornment and the sparkling. Mm-hmm. Michael Ray Charles' work, I mean, that kind of bling on the violence, you know, and the layered violence of the image really stood out to me. Mm-hmm. It moves at this crux from this kind of erasure and only being able to see the other as in this adorned way to that violence that emerges throughout the whole exhibition.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, and let's move forward. So this is also in that room if you turn to your left in that wall. And so again, okay, we're bringing together in front of you, what you would see and also what you would smell is a work by Violette Boulay, who is a Venezuelan artist. And I'm really interested in its juxtaposition to the work by Gerardo Rosales, also a Venezuelan artist, on the right side, the bright colors, and like what it means to put, you know, Houston-based artists from Venezuela in this conversation, in this space, and how there's something that for me is playful about the work of Rosales that's like whimsical, but then when you move closer to it, you see the kind of violence that he's remarking on, like all of the bodies are sliced into pieces, you know, separated, overextended, and you have to, so you should go see this work and get to see the large size of the piece, and you can stand for some time and engage it. And in conversation with Violette's work that you experience first as a smell almost, if you go up close to the soap, you will see it's a stack of soap, and the shape kind of, to me, echoes the indigenous architecture of Latin America. And the soap reads, remind me the text of the stamped on the soap. It's like a produced, sorry,
Hispano.
Hispano. So in my reading of that, in my own work on the Dominican Republic, there's like the Hispanicization of the identity that erases Blackness. And so I know Violette's thinking about the kind of mass production of this soap that can be found all over Latin America in the context of the Dominican Republic, and this kind of washing away of Blackness in order to claim a Hispanic identity and distance oneself from Blackness. The soap really is an effective tool for communicating that. And so that's how I'm experiencing that piece. I'm very curious about others and how they've engaged it. I have seen, I think, the work in other formations, but what I like about her work, and we'll see it again, is how she uses sort of this ordinary object in repetition to make remark things that we have to look at differently. So on the left side of this wall, you get to see, again, Laffy Olivia's work, two different pieces. And I think you had a more specific question about the second piece, Totem, that maybe.
Yeah, and I wanted to quickly jump in, Rachel, because I think what you raise, and just looking at that image again in that perspective, thinking about Violette and Gerardo's work, I think both Tyler and I were struck by, in many ways, these two works are influenced by the ideals and expectations they carried with them when they came to America. Because, some of other Violette's work is called Dream America. Gerardo talks about escaping violence within Venezuela and his past sort of growing up in a military boarding school. And then he arrives in the United States sort of with this idealization, and then is met with sort of mass shootings and school violence and all of the, very tragic public violence that sort of it becomes an epidemic within our society. And so I think that seeing their work and relationship there really kind of brings that to the forefront, creates that kind of conversation. And then you were mentioning, I think with Laffy's work, and especially with this idea of totem, we start to kind of venture into this idea of representations of spirituality and religious iconography, and it can be more abstracted in potentially sort of the Aztec formation that Violette sort of lays out the soap, or it can become much more prominent when we're looking at sort of particular religious representations. But I think that Laffy in this particular piece, you think about that totem, it's almost like an extension of her mental process and the architecture of her thinking, and an extension of her mental energy and thought making. Because you see textiles there, you see books that presumably she has read or have been influential to her. And so we were interested in that way of sort of creating a personal spirituality, sort of based on some of the forms and visualizations and languages that we typically associate with religious iconography.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that drew me in with the totem piece is the actual authors that she's included, Audre Lorde Zami, and she's included Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower there as part of this story, and the African mask at the top, right? So this like diasporic identity, even across multiple generations.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And Laffy, each of the works, we see tattoos, which are a significant theme across the whole exhibition. And it sort of felt like they lead you through. So she really presents us with the body as a canvas in this sort of way, where this kind of totem reflects that like a layered history, as you're saying, that one might be already carrying with themselves. And then depending on how you think about the tattoo as an adornment, or even like a reminder or message, and why people choose to tattoo their bodies. And it becomes really interesting at the end. We'll look at the pieces you put together, Matt Manolo's and Laffy Olivia's.
Yeah, and I should maybe just quickly point out too, to those who haven't seen the show, that Laffy kind of doubles down on that idea of inscription in the technique that she employs, which is a fresco technique that stretches back or extends back centuries, but really became prominent in the Renaissance, where the artist would put pigment into wet plaster and then plaster that onto a rigid surface. And so you have that color, that pigment embedded into this sort of increasingly sort of dense and heavy surface. And Laffy very much carves into that, and so she's not only painting on the surface, she's sort of moving into the surface. So it's a doubling of that inscription, Rachel, that you're mentioning.
And you all are welcome to drop comments or reflections along the way. Let's move forward because I want to show these and then we'll talk further. So on the other wall to the right, what you would experience is works by Jay Bilhan on your left side viewing this, and then in the back, Sarah Sedhoff's work, which is difficult to ignore because of the audio, and what you hear is the breath. So it's again a performance piece that sort of influences how you experience the broader space. And I was really taken by that work and the emotion that you are brought into as you near the work, and you see her, she's had someone stack bricks onto her body which stifles her breathing. And it is in response to reading about a health worker who died from COVID and went, undiscovered for 12 or 14 hours and was discovered with her child, 4-year-old child, with her body. And so you have this performance piece in response to that work, and the health worker's name is Deidre Wilkes. And what it brought up for me was the question of seeing the white woman's body and her effort to try to experience the grief and loss and suffering, and then also understanding that, again, it was a Black woman who was being impacted, and who are our health workers. And so she was sort of creating this moment of replication. But when you look at this and you stand in the museum from this vantage point, you also have this really interesting queer work recognizing the sort of aging gay white men in the work of Bilhan. And then in the back, it's Matt Manolo's piece that also captured for me a lot about whiteness and this textures of whiteness. Mm-hmm. So that's how I was reading your positioning of these works. And I was curious, like this piece right in front of us is Dario Robleto's work. And it was interesting to not have his work as sound, like if, experienced his work before very much as sound. So what you have there are pieces that are visual representations of the sound, but they didn't, for me, puncture the space as much as like looking across this exhibition and seeing kind of whiteness in these other forms, and some discomfort with these various images. Mm.
Yeah, great. And Tyler, maybe I'll hand it off to you, because I know Tyler and I very much discussed, especially this grouping of Bilhan, Sedhoff, and Robleto. Mm-hmm. And, and then seeing it with Matt's work, this is certainly sort of one of the clusters that we thought, in a more considered way. So maybe Tyler, I'll hand it off to you to kind of speak a little bit more in depth about that.
Sure. There are sort of two elements here that that you sort of made me think about, Rachel. One is this idea of sound in the exhibition, and then there's sort of on both floors of the exhibition. We think back to that first image we showed of Nick and Jake's work, of the sort of remnants of their performance. The sort of element I just wanted to mention that you hear as you enter the exhibition is a recording of this sort of emergency alert system that we hear. That many of us have heard on our cell phones, from our cell phones over the course of the pandemic, urging us to stay inside. So the Nick and Jake, they took that recording and made that a sort of elongated soundtrack as that work. And then you also hear the Ryan Hawk work, which we described. And then on the upstairs, you hear this work in this gallery by Sarah Sedhoff, this sort of very breathy noise that you hear in every corner of the gallery. And so how does this notion of sound, sort of the body as sort of responsive to these very particular sounds, whether of distress or something that reminds us of our own sort of liveliness, the human breath, the sort of emotion. And then in another, we'll see some images shortly, but then you also hear audio from a work by Francis Almendarez, which is a sort of very specific cultural reference to, it's footage from Honduras and El Salvador. So these sort of different threads, that's something that Stephen and I were trying to think about consciously, is what is informing the sort of, what auditory experience informs the visual experience, or vice versa. And then just speaking sort of very quickly about this, this arrangement of works here, thinking of Jay Bilhan's work on the left, Sarah's video, and then Dario Bletto. And then I would say also the work that is from the sort of vantage point of where the camera is, the sort of matte painting of Pritika Rajgaraya. Stephen and I were thinking too about what does it mean to sort of pose moments in the exhibition where the body is maybe not quite so literally visualized, and thinking about what does it mean to sort of portray emotion and to have an affectation of something that is otherwise unseen, made to be sort of translated through a different way. So for example, with Dario's work on the pedestal here, they're quite literally these heartbeats that are images of recorded, the sort of earliest recorded renderings of heartbeats in response to different states of emotional sort of duress or pleasure. So you're looking at those, at this work, this literal visualization of emotion, while also looking at the sort of conflictedly desirous images of Jay Bilhan's of these men, and then also simultaneously hearing and seeing Sarah's body sort of in this simultaneous state of distress. So again, thinking too about the sort of different ways that bodies mean different things too. So thinking of course about the sort of nexus, the title of the exhibition, the body as a site of danger and desire. So this sort of duality, once again, of these different images and how they sort of affect viewers' different experiences.
Yeah, and if I can just quickly note, I think that the positioning of Matt's piece, it's called The Color of My Skin. And you walk in there and really, and a piece you don't see in this particular image, but to the right of, Forgetting My Skin as a Ruin is a piece by Francis Almendarez that has a number, oh, thank you, right there. A number of pieces of found denim, jeans kind of woven together into this, what we would kind of recognize as a painted canvas. But I think these pieces in particular, they almost become surrogates or avatars for the body. Matt talks about treating his surfaces of painting as a skin that he wants to almost invite you to touch, if that wasn't part of the decorum of the gallery, to not touch the artwork. But this idea that we're not only representing the body, but in some ways channeling kind of the echoes and the residue and the temptations of the body within these particular objects.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, the material being like workers' kind of clothing and Dickies, I felt like. And,
yeah. Levi's and Dickies is the title.
That you layer on that skin and then you're understood as a worker in a particular hierarchy and social hierarchy. So that for me, like there's always these sort of points where it's like, okay, what is the articulation about how bodies are racialized in this space? And that is what I'm curious about here. And so I felt like Matt Manolo's work really is overt about that and how he's challenging, the marginalization of brown bodies in these spaces. And I was very new to Almendarez's work. And so we have this older piece that you see here, and then let's just quickly move to the last room I wanted to talk about with Almendarez's piece on the floor of clothing and then these videos. And so you can hear the videos much before you enter the space. And what I heard was not only sounds that were really familiar to me from the Caribbean and the Dominican Republic of singing and dancing and chanting, but also I heard West Africa and Ghana and what I could also hear in the villages. So that kind of blurred for me. I had this moment where it was like, wait, is that, what space am I hearing? But I understood it as diasporic. And I know he's a West Coast artist with roots in the Caribbean, particularly Central America, and thinking about Garifuna and African descended and maroon peoples and these traditions. So it was very obvious to me just through the sound. And as someone who studies like social media and visual images, it was really interesting to see these sort of old school television screens and how it's like a very different way to experience the video. And it didn't grab my attention in the same way because we're so used to having it right in the palm of our hand. But he had also kind of these interactive things where you could use the QR code and read more. But I thought that was interesting too, because the clothing, the heaps of clothing, to me and perhaps many people listening tonight, like really resonated around the currency of used clothing that's globalized. And so in my course on transnational experience, we read about like, what is this major industry of used clothing? And so it's like literally a skin from like, taking from the US and Europe, and this economy of like paquetes of clothes that get used in the Dominican Republic. There's whole industries built around that. And also in Ghana and West Africa, where they actually call the clothing Obruni Wewu in Ghana, which is like dead white man's clothing. But it's like a major economy. So I think he really hit on something around, the body and what gets left behind. And then this idea of like, what are even the traces from the West that remain in the clothes. And it's donated clothing that goes to churches and Goodwill. And you think, well, someone will reuse this, but you don't necessarily know what side of the world that will get used or how it will get accessed. So that is happening in one part of this space. And then you have Violette Bellay's work right beside it. And I was mentioning like, how she thinks so deeply about the object, but she takes these forks that are pulled to the piece through magnetization. But it's a commentary on, Nautla speaking Mexican worker in the restaurant and how little he was being paid to wash silverware, right? And so it's an exciting piece to me because of the texture of it, but also like digging down into the economy of labor and migrant labor. And so putting her photography right next to that makes a lot of sense to me in terms of the work. And I would have loved to spend more time with it just because I hope we'll get to see like interviews with Violette around this as well. But yeah, so, okay, so there's a weight to this piece that I wanted to point us to, and then I realized that we'd like some time for discussion. So the other images, I think we can just sort of, if you turn to your left, you start to see Charles's work and Zelaya's work. Again, they get to be in conversation. And so she's working, like he's working, especially with this smile that it's a racialized representation of the caricature. And then she's doing something where she's actually left on most of the pieces, the mouth is like obscured, but it's the eyes that stand out. And what's notable to me is that she is really thinking about brown bodies and the eyes. So there's this, and her work is throughout the exhibition, and this moment we have to kind of stop and think about the looking and who's looking at who in a piece that really highlights that. And I think in her conversation on Monday, she talked about being deliberate about thinking about from the perspective of Honduran American and brown, representing kind of brown bodies and the looking, and that is about power and shifting the script. So while you're looking at her work, it's looking at you. But just briefly in that last image, one more at the end, going the other direction, Amanda. Yes. So again, we have Laffy Olivia's work on the left, which is this wonderful textured painting as Stephen was talking about. And what I was drawn to both how, queerness gets represented in the visual. And so there's something very masculine about low-hanging denim and boxer shorts on this body that has a bra on, and moving up to the top, the face looks, resonates with the diasporic art or African art, but also on the arm of that figure, there is, and we don't have a close-up of it, but there's this veve or image of from Izili and Haitian, a religious tradition that she's utilizing that image, and then you can't see as much in the white, but there's the cock and cockfighting. So for me, it really resonated with symbols of the island of Hispaniola and where I do my work, but it's positioned right next to this really provocative piece by Matt Manolo that he spoke briefly about on Monday, the Prince Giolo, who's, it sort of captures this moment of archiving and gathering, but the skin of Prince Giolo was gathered for a British museum because of the tattoos on it. And so you have those two works, and then this very delicate work by, again, Gerardo Rosales, which gets at the dismemberment. That was the word that I was grasping for. And although it's ceramic, it doesn't capture the body or even the fleshiness in the same way that Ryan Hawk was able to on video, but it's still this remark, the distance between these pieces and this dismemberment that really resonates for me when I think about it, when I teach our students at University of Houston, not around the physical dismemberment, but this distance from this home that they, are so many first generation students, and what kind of literature and visual culture do we have to offer them that captures these experiences of loss that they're so often carrying with them. They articulate in the classroom, and they're trying to, find a way through education while we're struggling to center the value of the humanities, and these works capture so much that they understand about their experience often as racialized bodies in the world, but do not have the language to talk about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Rachel. Wow, it's just so poignant, and I think that, you really kind of hit upon that. I think particularly in this section, this idea of presenting dismemberment, the body in fragments, speaks in a lot of ways to its opposite, which is the longing for wholeness, or that desire for a larger completion, that remains outside of the grasp when the body is in fragments, when the psychology is in fragments. And so I think that it's sort of these are different expressions of distress and longing and desire.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, and trying to bring that back to thinking about how you embarked on this is a project of bringing artists together in a moment where we all feel really separated, right? I think I was wrestling with what is it about carriers, but and this fear of being in the same space together but what I was really able to see throughout were artists wrestling with those connections to something, much deeper that they use art to express that otherwise gets lost. And so even ending with this piece about by Laffy Olivia and thinking about, what the diasporic reach looks like for people, even if it's one generation or many generations back, that there's this touch point for how they understand themselves and how they're being treated in the world that we live in because of their racialization, the gender identity, and queerness, sexuality.
Yeah, and then kind of hitting on what Matt says with that very sort of poignant line when he says, "I forgetting my skin is a ruin," that's sampled from a friend of his, that poem that was written. And that just, to me, that it just always kind of hits you in the chest when you read that, because you think about sort of the traumatization and how deeply it's embedded, that it sort of manifests itself in different ways. Not even primarily through the conscious actions.
Yeah, and I didn't even point out his additional work with the sandbags, where he and it's written on them, a colonial mentality, and he has this moment like from his past. But again, it's like, how do we get away from this experience, or how do we understand that racialized bodies are always in relation to these structures of power and this coloniality, which is very different from how white artists are also trying to work through their relationship to racialized bodies, and particularly thinking about Houston and who our community is. And so I was really excited to be invited to this conversation because I cherish this community that is like Houston artists. And so I was so pleased that you brought all of these folks together into one space.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. And actually what you just said, I think really leads well into, so it's 7 o'clock. And so I did want to open it up to audience questions. And Beverly McPhail wrote one in our chat box that I think really speaks to sort of the comment you made. Can you see that, Rachel, or do you want me to? I can read it if.
She's referring to Sarah Sudhoff's work. She said, I found her performance piece moving, the white woman's performance piece moving, trying to share the pain and burden, but I could also be read as centering herself in a situation involving a woman of color. What is your reading of that? Well, I am interested in, that, and I sort of hinted at that, Beverly, around like, what is the dynamic of that? Does the Black woman who lost her life, does she get named, right, in the work? And but there isn't an easy answer. I wrestle with this with my students around, who gets to make film, who gets to have access to the spaces and how we tell stories. So one of the questions I had for the curators is how they work together in collaboration to create this space, but they also, Stephen and Tyler, have a lot of power in making decisions around whose voices are in the space and how, but Sarah is here. She might also want to speak to that.
I can say something. It's just a side note, but I actually happen to be half Cuban. So, so it's interesting, when you guys were saying, the white woman's body, I am perceived as white, I am half white, but I'm also half Cuban. And so in thinking about that story of that young woman,
apologies.
It wasn't me. First and foremost, I was connecting to her as a mother, as a single mother, and a single mother during a horrific pandemic that was starting to unfold. And we had so many questions and very little answers. And I was in isolation with my 2 children at home, reading about someone across the country who I had no connection with whatsoever, except to read her story and have an immediate bodily, visceral response to it. And so, that performance came from reading about her and connecting with her as a mother, first and foremost.
I had a very visceral response to your piece and like the sound of it. And like, I saw myself like moving away from it because I could feel, in my body, those sounds. And it's interesting you bring up, I identify as a Black feminist scholar and also mixed race, and thinking about, my own relationship to whiteness. And in my work and in my book, I center a lot of Dominican scholars who in some moments are read as white, but they don't claim that. So I don't think there's a simple answer for it. And so this is where these conversations are so valuable around how people see themselves. But it's still always a question for me of power and who gets to move in what spaces. So I don't know if, as curators, if you want to speak to a little bit more about like how would you choose which artists to include in this?
Yeah, and I certainly want to let Tyler, I want both of us to sort of chime in on this, but I can say, Rachel, I think that we hold a position of power. It's a conceit that we get the opportunity to bring artists together, and we formulate these clusters of relationships and conversations between the works. You picked up on a lot of them. I think one of the things when you think about curating a show is that you have to dismiss the idea that the audience is going to see the show in one particular way, that you can weave one singular narrative through the entire show, because we know the audience is always going to turn the opposite way that you predict, or see the show in many different sequences. And so really, I think when we think about curating, you think about those micro relationships between sort of the works that are immediate juxtaposition to create the strongest relationships and conversations, and then you kind of move out in concentric circles from there. But I think in terms of the overall formation of the show, you know, we keep a running list of artists that we're interested in, particularly in the local kind of context. And so I think when Tyler and I started to formulate the thematic that we wanted to, you know, establish and present with this exhibition, we started looking at all of those 15 artists and what they could bring to that conversation and how they represented the body. But you're also very right that there are a number of socio-political conversations that go in. You know, you have to be mindful as a curator today of the diversity that's being represented, the gender balance that's being represented, because it's so important. I think particularly with us at the University of Houston, to represent the voices within our immediate community. And I think that there's so many different kind of considerations that ultimately kind of coalesce into a curatorial concept. And those are just sort of a few from my perspective. I'm sure Tyler has sort of other thoughts.
I mean, the sort of only thing I would add from that is that in the context of organizing a group exhibition, I think that Stephen and my sort of ongoing goal is to think about what it means to bring sort of disparate voices, disparate in many senses of the word, into a space like the Blaffer, which is, of course, has such a specific relationship to the university, the Third Ward, and then the city, of course. And so it becomes sort of this evolving, you know, 15 artists, you know, that's, you know, depending on how you look at it, that's either really a lot of artists, or it's really not, in the context of a sort of larger evaluation of, you know, this sort of amazing community of Houston makers and thinkers. And so for Stephen and I, it becomes this constant conversation that happens between us, and then also just sort of trying to be responsive to conversations that we have with artists, with scholars, with thinkers, with makers sort of across fields, and feeling and sort of interpreting then what feels like it would be a meaningful contribution in the form of an exhibition. So, you know, I think we try very hard to not, you know, sort of silo ourselves out in the sort of decision-making or selection process. And it's really more about what is meaningful for our audiences.
Oh, I wanted to follow up. Thank you, Susanna, for clarifying that I was misreading one of the pieces at the end where I was looking at, I was actually looking at Ryan Hawk's work, which was The Skin. And it's Matt Manolo's piece of the drum, where he was talking about, on Monday night, he was talking about the drum stretched with images, or there's writing on it. And so I confused those two images, and Ryan Hawk has his work also all throughout the exhibition, and he has that kind of hand, and he's working with a different kind of materials, synthetic materials, whereas I think Matt Manolo's piece was a found object in the space. But you can see that there's like so much echo across these, and I don't, yeah. So I'm actually, I mean, as I said at the beginning, I'm really learning this kind of genre and excited to be invited into this conversation about how we talk about the works. And I've learned a lot from each of you around what you've compiled.
Oh, thank you. I want to just sort of ask our audience, you know, if there are any other questions, you can please feel free to unmute yourself and ask, or if you'd like to type into the chat, we're happy to take any questions.
I'm curious how many people have had a chance to see the exhibition. So maybe you can make it there before the 14th.
Yeah, I would say it's absolutely worth seeing in person. As I mentioned in the chat, I think Lovey Olivia's, the surfaces of her paintings are just gorgeous. Every time I look at them, and Matt's also, you just get so much more, obviously, out of the exhibition, being in the space. But certainly I've gotten a lot more out of the exhibition from listening to your observations, Rachel, and the dialogue that ensued. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I've learned so much from you, Susanna. So we'll have to chat more about.
Yes, we will.
Lecture.
I think I want to add too, Rachel, I sort of thought I've continued to kind of meditate on your question. And I think the whole sort of the premise of the curator is that, in so many ways you want to create this experience and create those themes and those synergies, particularly when you create a group show and you place work into conversation with one another that you can't have when you're just having a solo show. That the group context allows for that greater thematic engagement. But also as a curator, you kind of want to create these relationships and then get out of the way. Like, you don't want someone to come in and go, oh, this curating is magnificent. You kind of want it to just feel like that's the way it should have been, and then let the art and the artists speak to one another. So it's an interesting kind of line to straddle, where you want to pay the respect that these works are due, and yet you also kind of want to remove yourself out of that and just sort of let that the experience happen.
I liked your analogy of the dinner party that you had, and what the side conversations are, and I think it really stuck with me because I missed that space.
Yeah.
and the cross-pollination, and I'll be curious to see. We heard from some artists. Hopefully there'll be additional interviews on YouTube that we can access, and if artists, they see if they're interested in these pairings and conversations, even though you're creating these matches for them to maybe in future be in conversation with one another.
For sure. Like, I think for us, it was really revelatory to see Michael Ray Charles and Jasmine Zalea in conversation, and how fruitful and inspiring the relationship is between their work. And I think also seeing, the way that Michael Ray Charles kind of confronts and attacks the culture industry, next to Violette and Francis, when they're talking about more kind of industrial labor practices. So, again, some of those things you let them happen. They sort of happen in the gallery spaces, and the work always lives differently in person than it does on a floor plan, whether drawn or digital. So there are those wonderful moments of kind of serendipity when you put something together and it's like a chemistry experiment, like things start to percolate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has me thinking about, what I'm doing in gender studies and in comparative cultural studies as programs and departments at U of H, and kind of interdisciplinary work, and how, these are all artists, but they're coming from such different angles and using such different material, and they are kind of creating very interdisciplinary work to communicate about their embodied experiences in the world.
Absolutely. Well, maybe I'll throw it out one more time for questions. Last chance. Okay, if not, we really want to thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much, Rachel. Honestly, this was like the hour just flew by. Like, I just feel like it was just like a really great conversation. But as Rachel pointed out, we are still in the process of filming individual interviews with all of the artists, or a number of the artists. So they are being sort of gradually released on our Instagram, but then they're archived on our YouTube page. So please sort of stay tuned and keep tuning in for those programs. And if you want to learn a little bit more about Simon Fujiwara and Hope House, this week of public programs continues with Friday at noon. Simon will be in dialogue with two of the curators from the Holocaust Museum of Houston. So that will be our last public program of this week. And then again, the closing weekend of Carriers is this Saturday and Sunday. So thank you again. Thank you so much, Rachel. We cannot thank you enough.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Yeah. So nice to see all of you here in this virtual space.
Yeah, again, thank you all. Thank you all for joining us so much.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for coming.